thank you for coming back from the pub to the last slot of the day in the smallest room in the conference. We are wondering who we offended. I think it might be both of us. So the topic is where are the women in ELT, which might seem like a redundant question because clearly they're everywhere. This room is full of them. I'm one. Russ at the weekend. The question is like, well, they're everywhere, and they are. But also there are a lot of places where they are not. And so what we want to look at is where are they not? Is that a problem? If it's a problem, do we want to do something about it? So the origins for the talk came exactly a week after iatefl last year, because I'd written a typically tongue-in-cheek blog post about my ELT celebrity encounters. A couple of them are in here today. And Russ pointed out that nobody that I'd mentioned was female. Well, I can't think of any big names that are female. And so that started a discussion, which then became a year's worth of research, which has then become this talk. And we're not the only people that have noticed this or been talking about it. So in 2009, Gavin Dudney had mentioned on his blog, where all of the teachers seem to be, majority of the teachers seem to be women, but sponsored conference speakers are mainly men. And then Melanie Butler, who's the editor of EL Gazette, she was asking about whether or not there was a glass ceiling in ELT. So that was in 2010. Then Jeremy Harmer, a regular plenary speaker at conferences around the world, was wondering why he and his colleagues up on the stage were mainly men, but the audiences were full of women, and the conference organisers, the people who booked him, were female. ELT Chat, about 3 years ago, they had a running ELT Chat, if you know that, discussion on Twitter about whether or not there was sexism in ELT, and if it was morally right to apply a quota for gender when choosing plenary speakers. And then Julie Moore, who's a blogger, was talking about the big names in ELT, much as I suppose I had been wondering whether people would name women if they thought of influential figures.
Yeah, so very interesting. Everybody seems to think there's this bias with women and the men at the top, but no one seems to have actually looked at the figures and what they are. So we decided we'd look into this, and in order to do that, we thought of some kind of research questions. Now, neither of us are researchers, and so our research might not be, the most stellar, but we came up with these questions. First of all, are women in the majority in ELT? We weren't looking at applied linguistics, only ELT. Then we're looking at, are the big names mostly men? And in order to answer that question, we had to define what is a big name, which is actually quite a difficult thing to do. So the first question, are women the majority in ELT? So what we did is we wrote to Cambridge and a few other places, and we asked them about their CELTA courses and what the figures are. So they gave us the figures for 2010, 2011. That was about between 7,000 to 9,000 people who took the course, and the split was exactly, because they keep very good data, the split was exactly 60-40 female to male. And then we wrote to Delta and asked them the same question, and it was exactly the same figure, 60-40 female to male. And then we wrote to iatefl, who also shared their information about the last conference, and the number of speakers, I think it was about 600-ish, and they were also 60-40. And the delegates, anybody want to guess? It was also 60-40. And so we felt pretty confident that we could say this is, at least in the places we looked, there was a pretty clear 60-40 split. Now, we don't have information about the worldwide teachers, we don't know, but we have a hunch that it perhaps would be a little bit higher. We found this quote from Powell: most language teachers in secondary schools in the UK, and many in not all other countries, and in language schools worldwide, are female. I don't know where he gets his information from, but that's certainly what he thinks. So we've got this established. We've established that women are definitely in the majority. Then we wanted to find out whether the big names are mostly men or not. So we had to kind of operationalise this term big name, and we talked about it for about 2 weeks and went back and forth, and we ended up settling on well-known. So that's the phrase we used. Who are the most well-known people in the EFL? We designed a questionnaire, and we sent it out to various web pages and on Twitter, and we were kind of hopeful that maybe we'd get about 100 or so responses. and I'm sure maybe some of you in this room filled it in. If you did, thank you very much. We actually got 520 responses, so that was great. And when we designed the question we wanted to ask, we were inspired by a quote from Julie Moore. And Julie Moore said, considering language teaching is such a hugely female-dominated profession at grassroots level, it seems to me that there are a disproportionate number of men in positions of power and influence. I tried to come up with 5 names in ELT without consciously trying to think of women, and I bet there will be men and women. So that's exactly what we did. We asked people, the question was, please try to think of 5 names, don't Google it. And we'll see if there are more men or women. And so the results. So this was the question, who do you think are the most well-known people in ELT? And the top 5 that we got, how many women do you think were in there? Any guesses?
One.
None. One.
So there were none. The top 10?
One.
Penny.
The top 20?
Two.
There were 3 actually in the top 20. So we thought it was quite interesting that there was this 60-40 split, and then when you start looking at the names, it starts to get a little bit different. And if you look at the results more generally, what we found if we counted it up, so if we counted individual names that were mentioned, there were 161 men who were mentioned. So like each one of these would represent a person. So for example, this might be Hugh Della, and this might be Penny Ur. So there are 161 men mentioned by people and 89 women mentioned, which was also quite interesting with this 60-40 split. Another way to chop the data up would be to look at frequency of names. So how many times was a male name mentioned and how many times was a female name mentioned. And in that case, it's 1,421 to 295, which was quite a stark difference between that and the kind of the figures for the number of people in ELT.
Okay, so as well as our survey, we had a couple of other ways of thinking about who the big names were, and one of them was to look at plenary speakers on a worldwide scale, because this is an international industry, so there's no point just looking at the UK. So the second way was to look at publishing, because obviously that's another massive part of what ELT means. So the plenary speakers, I had to count a year's worth of conferences worldwide, counting the plenary speakers. It was an extremely tedious job that I started in September and I passed the rust in November because I just couldn't finish it. And I used a resource online. Is Tyson in here? No. Okay, so Tyson Seaburn's got a calendar where it's ELT conferences and events. And I started with the whole of 2014 and I went through this. Now sometimes I couldn't get the data that I needed because a conference in January didn't have the relevant information anymore, so I just skipped it. If it took longer than 5 minutes to find the information, I omitted it. I didn't look at online events, and I excluded anything that looked like it was applied linguistics instead of ELT. That left me with 63 conferences, and so the plenary speakers cut up like this. Of my 63 conferences, 32 of them had more male speakers in a plenary position than female speakers. 16 of the conferences had more women than men in the plenary roles, and 15 of them were what we called equal, that was like 1 of each or 2 of each or something like that. So if you add up the female-dominated plenary conferences and the equal ones, you still don't get the same number as the ones that were dominated by male. Clear bias. And the other way of looking at that is to count the number of plenary slots amongst those 63 conferences, and you can see 141 of those slots were given to men, and some of those slots were the same men at 4 or 5 conferences on the circuit. And then you've got 96 women. So again, clear bias, I think. And we must remember that plenary speakers are invited. This is not about women not putting themselves forward, this is about who's been invited. When we looked at publishing, that was a lot harder to quantify, because editing, everyone said to us there's lots of female editors, commissioning editors at senior levels and everything, and we wrote to the HR departments of some of the main publishers, and they weren't willing to give us their figures. I thought that was public information, but apparently it wasn't.
Surprisingly.
Yeah. Anecdotally, I think we can probably say that there isn't a particular dominance of men in that, but in fact it might be women who dominate that area. Looking at who writes the materials, same problem, because what you would need to really quantify that is a list of the top selling books. But would they be adult course books, or is that grammar reference books? Like, what would that list look like? And so I couldn't really do it, and also I think that there's a tendency now towards author teams to write materials, so those teams might be 6 people writing the intermediate level, 7 of them writing the upper intermediate. It's mixed, I think, and I think most people would agree who know the industry that that's also not something where there's a gender bias. But if we think back to the survey and the top 10 that Russ had up there with one woman, that is clearly a bias thing where people think first of men. How did we get to that situation if publishing doesn't reflect that, if materials writing doesn't reflect that? Well, I think the only way of answering that is to look at who the top 10 were, which I think is what everybody who did that survey anyway. So we were just looking at it from gender, but we've got a top 10 list. So this is what the top 10 looks like. So Penny are in the 6th position, as you all guessed. Now, I think there's a pattern here. In fact, I think there's 2 patterns. Apart from the fact that most of them are men, can anybody see a relationship or connection between those names?
Age.
Authors, yes. Age. Somebody said age. Somebody said age. Who was that?
Me.
Right. Okay. So they are all of a certain age. And and I showed this to somebody the other day, and they said, yes, it's the Rolling Stones of the ELT. Which is, not to say anything offensive about anything about people's age, but they have all come from a certain era, and I think the books that they have written, because as you said, they're mostly authors, are 20, 25 years old. So this has been set in stone. I reckon if you did that survey, you would get the same names 10 years ago, maybe even 20. So nobody's come up and replaced them. The other connection, I think, is to do with the kind of things that they wrote, which the red ones are people whose books were authority references when you started teaching, when you were on your CELTA course or TEFL course, whichever one you took. So they're your entry point into teaching. They're the people that you looked to on your course and possibly referenced again later. If you carry on and you do an MA or a Delta, you're going to start coming across the green guys, which are more linguistics. Ray Murphy is a slight outlier there, because he didn't write a reference book in the same way, but it's one of the biggest selling ELT books, and it's a grammar reference for students, generally recommended by teachers. So, he would be different as well, because he doesn't really appear on the conference circuit, so he's not up there because people have seen him speak. So this is quite interesting, I think, because it shows that the route to being in that big list of top names that everybody knows is 20 years old. If you wanted, as a woman, or even as an up-and-coming guy, to get on that list, you have to go back in time and you have to write. So, if some of these people apparently retired as well, so we told him State Marcus one's actually retired, so actually spaces should be becoming free. That's not happening. So if we look at that as the route, why or how can somebody duplicate it? Is that method available to anybody? Well, if they wrote books that are for professional development, then probably not, because this is quotes from a discussion on an ELT Jam post in the summer about ebooks for professional development and why they weren't really selling. So Ian Cook, who's a marketer for one of the big publishers, was acknowledging that the publishers are abandoning professional development publishing in order to focus more energy on the blockbuster courses where there's greater profit to be made. And there must be greater profit to be made, because Scott was saying that those books don't sell more than 200 or 300 copies in a year anyway. Why would you commission a new writer to write an authority textbook when you've got one that's selling masses? And then Lindsay Clanfield, who knows the industry very well, who's the founder of The Round, which is a publisher of ebooks. A lot of them are professional development. He's seen both sides of it. He's written both print and e-version methodology books, and he thinks the question should be, why don't teachers buy professional development books, period? Barring a few classic titles, which are the ones written by the guys on those slides, most professional development books are relatively few in print and perhaps fewer in e-book form. I think that route is closed, and it's closed to men as equally as it's closed to women. So there has to be a new way to get up there, maybe in the next 5 years. What's that going to be? Social media? I mean, is it tweeting? You tweet your way to the top? Is it writing these blockbuster course books? Well, I don't know, probably not, because they're written by author teams now. What other way could you get to the top now?
Okay, so is there a problem of gender bias in ELT? Things looked a bit clearer before, and now it looks a little bit more murky. Well, certainly the FAIR list, and Tessa Woodward think there is. The FAIR list, if you don't know, was set up in 2012 to make sure there was an equality of plenary speakers, and it's a really great, thing. So, you know, you can sign up for this, you can put your name on the list, and you can support it. We think it's a really great initiative. There are a couple of problems, though, that we noticed with it. I mean, it does have the positive pressure to change. So we've heard from people there now, kind of a little bit scared of just having a lineup of guys because they think they might get called out, and so they, you know, they might therefore add women. It's not the greatest motivator, but you know, I guess we can take it. There's also a lot of the literature we read suggested that some women might be reluctant to put themselves out there because of a confidence problem. They might not feel comfortable standing in front of a group of people talking. And the FAIR list offers a mentor scheme, so you can go and have somebody, a man or a woman, mentor you if you don't feel particularly confident about doing it. However, the FAIR list is only for UK conferences. You win a FAIR list award, and I found this quite interesting, if you have a ratio of 40-60. And in this case, it's 40% female and 60% male. So that would be the mark. So actually Tessa said yesterday, you know, we have a very low bar because it's difficult even getting that. In the first year the FAIR list run, there were only 5 conferences that met the criteria. Also, there's no burden for supporters. You can sign up to be a supporter of the FAIR list, and then you can just, you know, go and speak at male-dominated conferences. Yeah, so is that a problem? Is this a problem? This is the plenary speakers for a conference whose name we will not be releasing yet. This is 10 years worth of plenary speakers, and there are 29 guys who have spoken and 3 women over the 10 years. And when you see figures like that, it is a bit stark, I think. Are there really no talented women in the industry who could do this? I mean, why is this happening? The Eltons as well has been hosted 7 times by a guy, is that right? And twice by a woman. Yeah. Is there something perhaps of a vicious circle? While we were researching this, we saw an interesting Facebook post. So someone in the Aussie ELT group says, who would you love to come to the conference? You know, we're organising a conference, who would you like to see? And most of the people who responded to the post were women. Who do you think they wanted to see? Yeah. So I've colour-coded this here. And there are 5 women mentioned and 22 guys mentioned. And, you know, is there a situation occurring where people go to conferences and see men doing plenaries, and then they kind of, you know, they expect men to do plenaries almost? Is that what's happening?
Okay, so when you can't completely identify how much of a problem there is, it became more complicated than we expected to go, here are the solutions. We thought at the beginning that we kind of work out, like, here's the answer, everybody go away and do it. But it is much more complicated than that, and there's plenty of other industries where they've been looking at this problem. Design, tech, ed tech would be very guilty of it. So if you can't get away from that, then what can you do about it, and you should be doing something about it. So one of the things that I think tends to get thrown back at women at this stage is, you know, women don't put themselves forward, women need to be more confident. But I think what we've shown is that the infrastructure is preventing them, because you've got a situation where the same people are up there for 20 years and that's backed up by the conference circuit. So what can me being super confident do about that? Also, I think that people commonly say, oh, childcare, family issues, but quite a few of you know I had a baby 4 weeks ago, and a lot of people very much doubted that I would be able to come to this conference and do this talk. And I chose to just wait and see how I felt and make my own decision. If I had believed everything that was said to me, then I wouldn't be standing here now. But on the other hand, in October when I was 4 months pregnant, I did drop out of a publisher-sponsored event in Mexico because I didn't feel like I could manage that. So that was a really tough choice, knowing that I was going to be coming and making this topic iatefl. So it isn't easy, but I still think the infrastructure could have supported me. So what other solutions can you have other than making women kind of come forward? Well, could you compile a list of female speakers, people who are willing and very ready to do plenary sessions, put themselves higher up on the circuit, maybe with a little profile, a little video of them doing their thing and what the topics that they talk about? Like, would that be a reference? Because we wrote to that particular conference.
Yeah, we wrote to some conferences and we asked them, you know, we wrote to a number of conferences, do you consider this to be a problem? Do you think about gender when you choose plenary speakers? And one of them kind of said, we don't know any women, you know. Could you perhaps organise a list of women that we can look at? I mean, one of the things with this solution is, you know, it kind of solves one problem, but it's also a little bit, you know, I mean, the need to have to do this is a little bit kind of bizarre.
Yeah, now the other thing is, where the Fair List has got a thing that people sign up to saying they support it, could that be a harsher thing where people, so events could sign a pledge saying, we as an event pledge that we will at least strive to achieve what the Fair List is asking, what the Fair List is rewarding them for achieving? Could you do a more sort of like carrot and stick approach? Or could you get those male speakers that are appearing again and again and again to sign a pledge to say, I'm not going to speak at a conference that isn't more equal? Could you do that? Would they sign it? Yeah. Another thing is, could you publish the records of conferences like the one we saw? I mean, when somebody's got 10 years of data like that, and it's overwhelmingly, they're not making an effort, are they? So could you name and shame somewhere? I mean, what do you think?
Yeah. So what we realised quickly is that this is a huge topic and that we are not, as two people, going to be able to do anything about it by ourselves. You know, and so we've set up a website called Gender Equality ELT, and we're really hoping that some of you will come along to the site and maybe tell us what you think. You know, maybe you don't think it's a problem at all. We'd love to hear your views on it. This is a picture of the website. Yeah, so we'd like to really start a discussion about this and see where it goes from here.
Yeah.
So thanks for listening.
Thank you.